For this evening, I'd like to introduce Daniel Friebel. Daniel is a staff member with our Synchrotron, the Stanford Synchrotron Lightsource. He has his PhD from Bonn University, and then he took an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship and came here to Stanford. And actually, at the end of that fellowship, we offered him a staff position, and what can I say? The beer is better in Germany, but California has some compensatory advantages. So Daniel is one of the world's experts on catalysis, that is to say, the chemical reactions that take place on surfaces and are effectively advanced by things that happen at surfaces. And his expertise is understanding what goes on those surfaces at the atomic level, one atom at a time. So today he'll translate some of that knowledge for us with this topic of new fuel cell catalysts and their blueprint. So thank you very much.
Good evening. Thanks for coming, and it's a pleasure to have you all here. And thank you, Michael, for this nice introduction. I'd like to come back, though, to what you mentioned about the beer. So, generally speaking, you're right. However, this is where I'm from. This is Bonn, Germany, the former capital of West Germany. It's a beautiful city. You can see lots of trees here, a nice Rhine River with the barges slowly going upstream. However, the beer, well, it's not so much of my favorites in Bonn. I used to actually rather import that from other regions of Germany. We have only 2 skyscrapers in Bonn for 300,000 people. And you might think that the San Francisco skyscrapers are small compared to, let's say, New York City. But let's put one of them here and see, it's exactly twice as tall as this one, which actually is very new. I believe it was completed in the early 2000s. So as we're talking about architectural marvels of society, let me go to the next slide. One of the other things besides skyscrapers that really impressed me when I came to California the first time was this. This is, you get dizzy when you look at it for too long time, right? Loads of cars that can be accommodated by this. Now, this is really convenient, but unfortunately, we all know that this has some very unintended side effects, some of which are quite scary. So this is a typical picture of a short-term side effect of what we're doing on this planet. And these are long-term changes that you can see even from outer space. I think you're all familiar with this. I don't need to go into all of the details, but now here's the problem. This is my little son. He's just 2 years old, and as you can see, he's already practicing for his driver's license. Now, you know, this is difficult, right? I can't really take this away from him. So, how can I do something that he could still have this nice little habit, but do it in a way that it maybe doesn't affect the face of our planet so much, since he's still going to need it. Fortunately, there's another option. We have this here, our sun, and actually the sun is blasting us with an amount of energy every day in a very reliable manner, and it's going to last like this at least for the next 1 billion years until it'll actually turn a little bit too hot, so we won't be able to live here anymore anyway. But we would never be able to spend all that energy. Now, this is nice for any kind of application that's stationary, since we can make electricity from either wind or solar or even biomass if we want. And we can use this electricity in our homes and in plants, like industrial plants. However, how do we get this power onto the road? This is a problem, right? Well, one could think of something like this, right? At least on the lower deck of the Bay Bridge, that would probably work. But could you imagine all freeways having such a structure here? It's maybe a little too tricky. There is another solution, though. We all know that we can turn electricity into hydrogen. We can take water, add some salts to it that it becomes electrically conductive, apply a voltage, and split the water into hydrogen and oxygen. We can then take this hydrogen and actually convert it back in a fuel cell. This is just like an electrolyzer running in reverse. So we take the hydrogen, split it into hydrogen atoms. We take oxygen, split it into oxygen atoms. The hydrogen become protons, go through this electrolyte, combine with the oxygen atoms, form water molecules. And this is all the exhaust coming off such a car. That's perfectly clean, right? And then we could power a car with such an electric engine. And this would be a great improvement even if we make the hydrogen from fossil fuels, which currently most of the hydrogen that we produce comes from. Because this kind of conversion of fuel to into driving a car is much more efficient than a combustion engine. Now, the concept for a fuel cell has already been around for over 150 years. In 1843, this researcher here, Sir William Robert Grove, he built the first prototype of a fuel cell. And you can see these little glass things here with platinum in there, and this is filled with hydrogen and oxygen. Here's the electrolyte. And he was already able to report how powerful this device actually can be, because he wrote about this, that he was able actually to shock 5 people that were holding hands, and one of them was holding on to this device. So that's promising, isn't it? Unfortunately, in the 1850s, there was no feasible way to produce hydrogen, unfortunately. So it wasn't really possible to use this thing much. And then a few years later, you all know what happened. The oil boom started around the early 1850s. And then we have a typical scene from 1910. This is actually here in California. Actually, what looks like a lake here, this is actually oil, okay? And you see that people back in those days weren't so concerned about such a spill. They're actually posing for a picture. Here, this guy, they're actually boating on an oil lake, and this guy, it's hard to see in this photo, but I believe he has a big smile on his face. And this here is Dryhole Charlie. He made this, and he was so glad that he got rid of this reputation that gave him his nickname. Okay? So this is what happened then, and basically paved the way for us to go into this kind of infrastructure that we live in nowadays. Well, not everything went this way. There was the space shuttle, for example, which couldn't use combustion engines when it needed a power source in outer space. So somehow there was still development going on fuel cells, and they've made it into quite formidable devices. You can see one here. And here, if you go to Emeryville, you can actually find a hydrogen fueling station, and AC Transit operates a few buses that run on hydrogen with fuel cells. And some of the hydrogen is actually generated with solar panels, with using an electrolyzer. Now, why don't we see those buses everywhere? And why doesn't Tesla's new model drive with fuel cells? It's running on batteries. Now we come closer to the problem. Let's see what this thing looks inside. And then you actually see when you unscrew this here, you'll see actually just a stack of different plates. And these gray plates here are for electrical contact and to diffuse the gases, the hydrogen and oxygen, to where they are converted into water. Nowadays, the electrolyte is not water anymore. It's actually a membrane that's similar to, it's like vortex, except that it's modified chemically in a way that it conducts protons very well. And then you have several of those in series, as many as you want, depending on how much voltage you want to get. Now, why is this not available on a large scale? Let's get a little closer to the problem and zoom inside the heart of such a fuel cell. Here's the membrane that I just mentioned. As I said, almost like vortex. And here are the so-called gas diffusion layers. This is just the porous carbon through which the hydrogen is allowed to come in from one side. The oxygen is coming in from the other side. And then you see this little crumbly stuff here between the membrane and the gas diffusion layer. What is that? That is a catalyst. What does this catalyst do? It rips the hydrogen molecule apart into two hydrogen atoms and makes protons. And they go to the other side, and there oxygen is ripped apart into oxygen atoms, takes electrons, and makes water together with the protons. Whereas the electron current goes through the engine that you want to power, for example. Now you can already see that actually this crumbly stuff here is a lot thicker than this. And this sort of indicates a little bit what the problem is in this device. We have a bottleneck for the reaction here, which is the half of the reaction that's called oxygen reduction reaction, OR. So this is just the pathway where an oxygen molecule comes in. Here's the metal catalyst. It pulls the oxygen molecule apart into two atoms that will be bound to the metal surface. Then the proton comes in, one after the other, and eventually you form water that goes off the surface. Now, why is this so difficult? Let's look at an energy diagram. What do we see here? This direction indicates the reaction coordinate. That's just the course of the reaction as it proceeds. And here again, I'm showing the individual steps of this, the intermediates of this reaction, and each intermediate state corresponds to an energy. Okay? It's like when you take a ball and let it fall down the steps here, right? It has a lot of energy up there, and it'll lose most of its energy when it goes down here. Now, what does it look like here? So the oxygen comes in, gets dissociated, and the energy goes downhill for nickel, for example. Now, what's the ball going to do once it's at the bottom? It won't come up again by itself, and this is the problem. Here we need to put in energy again to continue the reaction. So the problem is somehow the oxygen is bound too strongly here on a nickel surface. Why is it actually bound strongly to a nickel surface? The reason is what happens when you make a surface. You take a chunk of metal and you cut it apart. What you do then is you take away metal atoms that would usually be binding to the metal atoms that are now forming the surface. So these atoms are missing bonds to neighbor atoms. And they don't like that usually. So usually they would like to compensate for that a little bit. And they do that by grabbing oxygen, for example, from their environment and binding it. And then the binding to the oxygen can become so competitive that the internal bond between the two oxygens will fall apart. So does nickel. Now platinum binds a little less strongly. And this is actually a good thing, because now we don't have to go that far uphill in the following steps of the reaction. And now look at gold here. This is why gold is the most noble of all metal, because such a reaction from an oxygen molecule near the surface to two separated oxygen atoms on the surface, the gold actually doesn't like to do that. It's going uphill in energy. Now, from these three metals, platinum is the best catalyst. And now we have a little bit of an economical problem. Where do you find nickel? Well, this guy here is sitting at the laundromat, and I'm sure before he walked in, he had his pockets full of nickel. Okay, you find it, this is not pure nickel, but at least like 10, maybe 20% nickel is in these coins. So it's a very abundant material, and it's very cheap. It's cheaper than the value of the face value of these coins. Now, where would we maybe find platinum? Well, let's say, oh, what's this guy reading there? Looks like, if I look closer, is that some kind of a gossipy magazine? I don't know. It's like, oh, I see. So, oh, Kim's 15 million duels. Well, let's take a look. Now, here we see platinum. And I think this might be some platinum as well. So platinum is really expensive. And this guy here has a hard time affording that, not to mention actually making little particles of that and sticking them into his car, okay? So now I've only shown you three metals here. Couldn't we just go through the periodic table? I mean, we have 92 naturally occurring elements, so there has to be something that's cheaper than platinum that does as good of a job, shouldn't there? Now, I've colored, so first of all, we don't even have to talk about these here because they're not catalytically active at all. Forget about them. These here, forget about them. They don't do it. What's left is the so-called transition metals. And now I've color-coded the metals a little bit. So blue are the ones where this part of the reaction becomes too difficult. So they hold on to the oxygen too strongly. The red ones are the ones where the first step is too difficult. So the bond breaking in the reaction as opposed to the bond making. The poor bond breakers are gold and silver, and the poor bond makers are almost everything else. Only if you look at the level of coloring, you see the platinum here is closest to sort of neutral, and that's where you would want to be, right? You would want both bond making and bond breaking steps to be equally fast. And we can take this oxygen, platinum, or oxygen and generally oxygen metal bond strength actually as a descriptor. So as just one parameter, one number that will tell us how good of a catalyst that we have. So here is again the strength of this oxygen bond to the metal surface. And on the vertical axis is the activity of the catalyst, that is how much current is it going to produce in a fuel cell. And you see this is going over a huge range. These are actually, each tick here is a factor of 1,000. And you see platinum, as I've shown you before, is the most active metal. Palladium is not so bad, coming close. Silver already worse. Let's look at copper, something that's abundant. 1,000 times worse than platinum. So using another metal doesn't seem to work. What do we do? Well, there's something, you know, how you can fake gold, for example. You make a brass that's yellow and it looks like gold. So could we fake platinum somehow? Does anybody have an idea? Could we make something that comes close to here from two other elements on this chart? Who has a suggestion? Which two metals could we mix, maybe? What do you think? Oh, I hear silver and palladium. Okay. I have to look at my little notes here. I made a little note. Oh. It's a good idea, isn't it? Because you would think it would come out here in between, right? Well, unfortunately, I can tell you where this comes out. It comes out about here. Why is that? Let's look at a different combination. Looks like we have to gamble, right? So what happens if I've mentioned before platinum, gold, and I mentioned nickel. What if we mix nickel and platinum? I'll show you where it is. Come on. There. How is that possible? We take platinum and we take something that's really, really, really bad at doing the catalysis, and we get something that's better than any one of those. Well, in order to understand this, we have to go a little more into, we have to go a little bit more into the details. But let me come to another problem. I mean, if this was it, right, then we would be done and you could all go home, right? So I'll have to show you another problem first, why we can't use this. You all know what's going on in Europe, where I'm from, right? You've read the news about the euro crisis. Now, when the euro coins were introduced, there was already a problem. Some people found out that when you put a €1 coin into artificial human sweat, after a while it looks like this. And what happens is actually that the alloy, that's the silver color here, contains nickel, and the nickel leaches out at a dramatic rate. Now I can tell you that the environment that's inside an operating fuel cell is way more aggressive and way more corrosive than human sweat. So what's going to happen to this if you build an electric car that runs on fuel cells with this alloy? You commute to San Francisco maybe 1 year or so, and at the end of the year, your catalyst will look like this. And it will be 10 times less active. So that doesn't help. So what do we do now? We can continue gambling with more combinations of metals, but maybe we don't have enough time to do that. So we need to do something more directed. And how could we do this? So we need to understand in more detail how the catalyst metal actually does its job of wrestling down the oxygen molecule. And for that, we need to know, first of all, what do these metals look like on the atomic scale, and then how do they bind to oxygen? What do these metals look like? Have you been to the farmer's market last Sunday? You would see something like this. Oh, what does this have to do with catalysis? Well, this and this and this and this and this is exactly what the structure of metals looks like, especially those transition metals that we're talking about here. They all stack the same way as oranges and apples at the farmer's market. They make so-called close-packed structures. And now if you look at the different sizes, well, this might be gold, maybe this is platinum, and this could be nickel. Nickel is a little bit smaller, okay? If you don't believe me that this looks like atoms, I'll show you something else. This is what I did during my PhD work in Bonn, Germany. I was using a scanning tunneling microscope, and what this does is it scans a metal surface with an ultra-sharp metal tip. And the tip follows the topography of the surface, and what you get then is an image like this in false colors. It looks identical to this, doesn't it? Pretty much. Now, what happens with this platinum nickel alloy when you make it? This is roughly what, I'm only showing one layer, what nickel looks like, and this is what platinum looks like. And you see these two numbers here, that is the distance, the nearest distance between the atoms. And it's the same all over the arrangement, right? Now this says about 2.5 angstroms. What is 2.5 angstroms? Well, if you take the length of 1 inch and you divide that by 10 billion, then you arrive roughly at this length here, okay? So that's about 1/10,000th the size of an inch, the scale that we see here. This is how small atoms are. Now you look at the platinum and you see here you have almost 2.8 angstroms rather than 2.5. So it's a little bit larger. What happens now if you mix the two of them? Now, you know how it goes with oranges. They're always a little bit soft. So if you want, you can actually squeeze them a little bit without breaking them, right? And this is exactly what happens in an alloy. The two metals find some sort of a compromise in terms of their distance. So the bigger platinum atoms get squeezed a little bit, and the nickel atoms, they have a little more space. And then they arrange exactly in the same type of structure here. It's still these layers with an hexagonal arrangement here. Now, what does this do to the catalyst? First off, I'll have to tell you, in this catalyst here, the nickel itself actually doesn't do anything about the catalysis. It doesn't influence the catalysis by itself, by binding to the oxygen. What happens is, because the platinum atoms are squeezed closer together, they have less of a desire to bind oxygen atoms. Therefore, the platinum-oxygen bond is weakened a little bit, and this is what pushes the nickel further to the top of this view graph that I've shown you with the activities of the different catalysts. It actually pushes it slightly over the top. So what do we need to do to find a better catalyst? We need to find a similar combination, right? Two different elements, one somewhat smaller than the platinum, and make sure that the platinum atoms get squeezed together enough such that we can get a very active material. And now we want the other material not to be something like nickel. We want it to be something that's stable enough against corrosion. Now, could you imagine yourself being at Safeway and trying to make such an alloy out of apples and oranges? Do you think you're going to be able to make that before security comes and picks you up? Probably not. You might have a chance, though, to make something like this. You just take oranges very quickly and put them on top of the apples. Just one layer. Now, for scientists, this is a much easier way to describe a bimetallic system than this. Because here you have so many different possible arrangements. Here you have just one, and each platinum atom has exactly the same environment. So you can do spectroscopy, which is what I'll come to soon, in order to see what each atom is doing, and then you'll know each one is doing the same thing. So you can really understand what they're doing. And here's an example. The black spheres here are rhodium atoms. Now, what does this 111 mean? That's simply, if you go back to this farmer's market picture, these faces here of these pyramids, those are so-called 111 surfaces. You look here, for example, at the top of this pyramid, you see these 4 atoms are arranged in a square if you look from the top. That would be called a 100 surface. This is just a little bit how we name these things. In the following, I'll only talk about this type of surface. Now let's get back to this graph here. By the way, do you know what this is called? There's a very colloquial term for how we name this. We like looking at things and keeping it simple. So for us, this looks like a mountain, and some of us like volcanoes very much. And that's why we actually named this, or actually mostly this person here, this Jens Nørskov, he actually is the leader of SUNCAT. It's one of the departments of SLAC. And he contributed a lot to this kind of research. And he pretty much coined the name for the so-called volcano plot. Now, I have to tell you, Jens, he's working as a theorist. So everything that you see here has been made up in a computer. And I don't know how much you trust what computers predict, but sometimes, well, we should do an experiment to confirm if the computer does it right, because these calculations are so complex. What if there's a small error? Now, let's see what happens in the experiment. Oh. Now, this is strange. As you see, so here are the computed activities, and here are some experimental data. And it looks like everything is a lot more active than predicted. You still see roughly the trend of the volcano, as you would expect, but it's far from what you would think. Like, look at this platinum on rhodium, for example. It's about, what is this, almost 100 times more active than what we thought. So what did we do wrong? To answer this question, when you have such a fundamental question, what is the best place to go to do a useful experiment? You come to the Stanford Synchrotron radiation light source. And this is also how I came here in the beginning, 2007. Anders Nilsson, my supervisor, he attracted me to SLAC. And the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation contributed to the funding. And Hermann Winnick helped hosting me here for the first 2 years that I spent here. And now this is the team that did the X-ray experiment together with me at beamline 6.2 at SSRL. And about in the right half of the picture, you see people who are actually staff at the beamline or have been staff there. And what really amazes me about the synchrotron environment is here in this picture, you see only one end station out of more than 30 that are available at SSRL. And at this beamline, some of these people have done so many different experiments. They have brought the so-called dino bird, the flying dinosaur, back to life, the Archaeopteryx, and shown that it actually had feathers using X-rays. They have unveiled the mechanism of photosynthesis on the atomic scale, how photosynthesis works, and many other things. And it's amazing how these people work pretty much like universal scientists used to do. It's so versatile what you can do with this instrument. So what exactly did we do here? We built an electrochemical cell which mimics what happens inside a fuel cell while it's operating. And we had our sample, which was this perfect platinum monolayer on a rhodium substrate. And we shine our X-rays onto the sample. The sample gives off X-ray fluorescence because the platinum atoms become excited by the X-rays, and we record this X-ray fluorescence as a function of the energy of the incident X-ray beam. Now there's something special about this beamline, which is usually if you do this type of experiment, you get something that looks like the blue curve here. Now, this instrument has this arrangement here. Those are spherically bent perfect crystals made of germanium. They're really shiny and they're bent, and what they do is They focus the X-rays that come from the sample onto a detector, but they focus only a certain energy, like a certain color of X-rays. Okay, so it works a little bit like a prism when you do something with visible light. And what this high-resolution spectrometer does to the spectra, you can see here, if you compare the blue curve with the red curve, you see all the features in the spectra much more clearly. And this allows us to understand the spectra with much more detail than what's been possible before. And I mentioned before we would like to understand how the platinum atoms interact with oxygen while they're doing the job of the oxygen reduction reaction. Now, we did the experiment. Here's a close-up view where you can see our crystal. This is rhodium, and there's a single layer of platinum atoms on top of that. And we shine the X-ray, we get the fluorescence out, and this is what our X-ray spectra look like. I'm showing here at first just an experiment with pure platinum where we haven't done any modification by bringing two metals together. And what you can see is actually 4 different characteristic spectra that are taken at different operating voltages of a fuel cell. The black line is at a very low voltage. This is actually what we would see on the opposite side of a fuel cell electrode, where rather than reducing oxygen, where it's doing the job with the hydrogen. Then we see the blue curve at higher potentials. You see the intensity in this region here is increasing. But then as we exceed a certain voltage, all of a sudden we see a big peak here on this side at higher energy. Now, we turned back to the theorists in order to help us understand what these spectral shapes, these spectral fingerprints actually tell us. Okay? So this is Chris O'Grady. He works with Jens Nurskopf, and he's taking care of these supercomputers. There are many nodes running at the same time doing immensely complex calculations. What this basically does is it solves the Schrödinger equation, but not for a hydrogen atom, but for a complex system with many, many, many metal atoms that have each of them many, many, many electrons. So only Moore's law made it possible that we can do these types of calculations nowadays. Now, what does the theory tell us about the spectral signatures? We were able to produce something that looks similar to the black curve here by simulating a structure in which the platinum surface binds hydrogen atoms. Then we were able to simulate something that comes close to the blue curve by simulating just a clean platinum surface with nothing on it. What did we do next? Now it gets interesting. We put oxygen atoms on the surface, and we get this increase of our signal here. So the red curve here is the signature of atomic oxygen bound to the platinum surface. We're probing it indirectly. The response here actually comes from the platinum atoms, not from the oxygen atoms. But they respond how they feel the oxygen atoms being on their surface. Now, the green curve, this is platinum oxide. This is also platinum binding to oxygen, but in a very different way. So this is what corresponds to the red curve, whereas the green curve corresponds to something like this. So here we have platinum oxide, and you can imagine, like, you go to the fruit stand and you decorate a few strawberries on top of your oranges, okay? So you don't change much about how the platinum atoms are arranged. Here, you completely tear apart the platinum atoms the way they're arranged in the metal. So you actually destroy the metal, and you put the oxygen atoms in between. So you make a new compound, and that is platinum oxide. Now, what we really want to have in the fuel cell is this here, because this is an intermediate of the oxygen reduction reaction. We do not want this to form, because when this happens, once we have platinum oxide, it's very difficult to bring it back to the metallic state up here, and this is not useful at all as a catalyst. So it would actually degrade the catalyst. Now we turn to our model catalyst where we had put a single layer of platinum atoms on a rhodium surface. And we looked at the same type of spectra, and this looks pretty boring, doesn't it? If you analyze these data, you'll find out that each of the spectra here at the different voltages can be explained with a mixture of only two components. And you have one pure component here at the lowest voltage and one pure component here at the highest voltage, and everything in between is just the mixture of those two. And everything we could find here is clean platinum at low voltages, platinum oxide at very high voltages. So the platinum surface in this case doesn't seem to like to bind to oxygen atoms at all. It behaves a little bit like a gold surface, actually. Remember how it's going uphill on a gold surface. We then found out that we can actually make this deposit of platinum atoms on the rhodium surface in a different arrangement. So rather than spreading out the layer in this well-ordered fashion, we made little islands, three-dimensional islands of platinum. And what happened now was when we analyzed the spectra, you see this looks a lot more complicated than the graph on the left side, which looks much cleaner somehow, that we were able, depending on which voltage we would consider, we would find hydrogen on the surface, we would find oxygen on the surface at high voltages, and eventually at very high voltages, again, we would destroy the catalyst and make platinum oxide. So this means we have a combination of the same two metals, but if we just put them together in a slightly different way, we dramatically change how they interact with oxygen. Now, what does this mean if we put these two combinations on the fuel cell volcano plot? It means that actually this should become a lot more active when we turn it into this. Now we wanted to understand why is it actually that this binds oxygen more strongly than this. Now there's two effects that cause this. First of all, if you look at these islands here, and you look at a platinum atom here in the center on the top of the island, it has, in this example here, two layers of platinum in between itself and the rhodium underneath. This means it will feel less of the influence of the rhodium because it's further away. So the effect of the rhodium in weakening the oxygen adsorption energy is actually less than for this perfect single atomic layer. The second effect is, if you look closer, you remember when I said how you make a surface, you cut a piece of metal in half. So you cut away metal-metal bonds. And since the metal atoms are missing those neighbors, they would like to compensate by binding to, for example, oxygen atoms. Now, if you look closer here, you can see a lot of atoms here around these edges and corners that are missing a lot more neighbors than the ones that are here in this perfect plane. Okay? And what this means is that these edge and corner atoms will have more desire to bind to oxygen atoms. Now, we wanted to really understand this in detail. What I've given you is more of a qualitative picture, right? So we turned back to the theorists, and here is the whole group of them. And in particular, I'd like to point out Venkat Viswanathan, who contributed a lot to these detailed calculations. And so what did he do? He took here's again an example for such a three-dimensional island. He actually took many of these, and then he let an oxygen atom sit in any of these different sites that are marked here with different symbols. I'll come to that in a little bit, what these symbols are supposed to mean. And for each of these configurations, he would calculate how strongly does this particular site bind to an oxygen atom. And he could show then that the individual sites are actually all over the place in how strongly they bind oxygen. So this gives you a handle, right? You can make a certain site and it will have its own specific activity, just locally. You can even have adsorption sites that are exactly at the top of the volcano, that are as active as they can be. Now, unfortunately, you see this, I've tried to mark them a little bit intuitively. Unfortunately, we can't use these sites. Well, why is that? If you look at this example here, and you see where these sites here are, you see here is a place where you have actually the platinum atoms not in this triangle, but you have this square arrangement. Now, when I was a teenager, when I was going home from school, I had to take the bus. And us kids, we always thought on the bus, the coolest place where you want to sit is the very last row. Okay, so all the cool kids would sit in that row. Unfortunately, I wasn't one of the coolest kids, so I would usually not get to sit in that row. And whenever I would board the bus, that row would already be occupied. This is the last row on the bus here, okay? This is the place that binds oxygen so strongly that it will always be occupied. Now, the next problem is these cool kids on the bus. They were usually quite some bullies, you know? So the next coolest place would be the next row in front of the last row. That's this one here. Now, unfortunately, you know, they would pull your hair and they would just, you know, they would just make you feel uncomfortable there. And this is exactly what oxygen atoms do to each other. They don't want to sit that close to each other. They repel each other. So therefore, unfortunately, there's only a very, very slim chance that these sites here will ever be used during the catalytic reaction. But we have the second best sites still available. They're far away, far enough from the bullies, and they're still quite a lot more active than pure platinum or this, what we started out with. So, could we make a catalyst that has as many of these sites as possible? And the answer is yes, we can. And here is what it would look like. So this is actually the blueprint for a new catalyst that would be more active than pure platinum. And at the same time, it would be stable enough to survive for a long time under operating conditions of a fuel cell. And this is about as close as it comes to the top of the volcano if we could make only these islands of platinum on the surface, with as many of these yellow sites here as possible. Now, how much more active is it? Could be on the order of 5 times better than pure platinum. Imagine 5 times better means you could use 5 times less platinum in a fuel cell, and that's a huge portion of the cost of such a device. Now, you might think, well, you know, can you really make this? This is again in the computer. how I am going to make sure that you don't end up with this. So here you have a mixture of various islands, and this is actually the one that we measured on. And this is actually a little bit worse than platinum. However, this idea that we published was, it inspired another group of experimental researchers actually at the Brookhaven National Lab. So they took this idea and they took a slightly different system, but you have the same trend here. Platinum and ruthenium is a combination that's just awful. But then they made nanoparticles of ruthenium, and you see here a picture that was taken with a transmission electron microscope, where you can see the atomic columns of this nanoparticle, okay? And the core of this particle consists of ruthenium atoms, and then they engineered these particles in such a way that the thickness of the platinum shell on the outside would be just right to go up all this way. And this is how close it came to our blueprint. So this actually works. Now for the future, of course, we don't want any of these metals either. Rhodium, ruthenium, I mean this combination, that could be Kim's next wedding ring maybe. So we'll have to go on, continue, and find a combination that does the same thing. But what I would dream of is making such a combination out of platinum and maybe tungsten or molybdenum, which is quite abundant. Now, let me come to the end. I've shown you a little bit what we're doing in order to make fuel cells more efficient, and that's on this side where we convert fuels into electricity. And of course, we would like to complete the whole cycle. So we would also like to make the fuels efficiently using renewable energy. It's possible already to make hydrogen that way, as you've seen. But the dream would be, you know, that there are a lot of problems with hydrogen. It's not so easy to store it, it's not so easy to distribute it. Some people think it's dangerous, although there are little different opinions about that. What we would really love to do would be to make a liquid fuel that we could just handle the same way as we're used to with gasoline. And one such fuel that would be very promising and that could also be used in a fuel cell would be methanol. So the holy grail of electrochemistry nowadays, I would say, is actually to find a catalyst that successfully can break up the carbon dioxide molecule and reduce it to, for example, methanol. This would really solve our problems, because then we could just recycle all the CO2 that we've already put into our atmosphere and make something useful of it. And with that, I'm done, and I thank you for the attention.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure you folks have some questions. So please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, but then wait for the microphone. We're being taped. So please, who would like to ask a question? Over there.
Fred Zeiss. You showed a on a triangular side with the center one with 4 oxygens around it. What if it was say 7 atoms? Would you get more oxygens in there, or more groups of
I guess
4?
So you're referring to this picture here, right?
Yes.
So it's quite simple geometry, right? if you, you want to have as many of these sites that are marked in yellow as possible. Now, when you make these islands larger, what's going to happen is the number of these will increase, but at the same time, these sites in the middle of the terrace will become more as well. And unfortunately, this number here grows faster than this one here, which means that the activity will drop. So what you would want to do ideally is to really control the size of these islands. Controlling the shape is actually not so unrealistic, because if you look at the arrangement of the metal atoms here, then this is actually quite stable. So by simply applying enough heat while you make such a structure, the atoms might just rearrange themselves exactly the way you want them. What can be a little more tricky is to control the size. However, this is also an idealized model system where you have a very, very large surface. Just imagine the whole farmer's market would be one crystal of oranges, okay? So you would have the uniformly covered with oranges, and there's no defect, nothing, okay? And then you put down these islands. Now, in the experimental system, you have a nanoparticle, and this gives you more freedom actually to tolerate less perfect structures that can still be very active, because you have just enough of the most active sites.
Okay. Another question? Oh, please.
Heidi Barnes. I had a question, let's see, for hydrogen gas detection, one of the primary sensors is palladium nickel because of its reliability. Mm-hmm. And so I was, in terms of, doesn't degrade over time. And so my curiosity is, have you looked at palladium nickel?
This is actually a very good suggestion. And I can tell you that we're actually working on that also. So palladium is a promising candidate for actually completely replacing platinum with something that's more abundant, although, well, the market price of palladium will also be dependent on how you use it. So it might actually shoot up if you start building a lot of fuel cells with it. But it's a promising idea, and we're working on that. Now, what's a little bit of a problem with palladium is that I've shown you that there's two different ways how oxygen can bind to the metal. And the problem with palladium is that it is much easier to form palladium oxide than it is to form platinum oxide from platinum. And the challenge that we're facing here, and that is what we're also working on in our research, is to find a way how could a combination of two metals not only improve the catalytic activity, but at the same time also improve the stability.
Other questions?
I understand the point of this is eventually to generate electricity, but would applying an electric charge to that structure, would that affect the oxygen binding? Would it be a gain or a loss?
So the question is whether the effect of, you're right, in a fuel cell there's a certain voltage, and the presence of this voltage has an effect of how the atoms bind to the surface. When I was showing you this chart where you see the energy levels of the different steps along the pathway of the reaction, I was showing you only one particular voltage which corresponds to when the fuel cell just sits there and produces zero current. That is because at this voltage, water and oxygen are equally stable. Now, as you start passing a current through the fuel cell, the voltage will have to be reduced a little bit in order to get the reaction going. And what happens as a result is that the energy levels of these intermediate species will shift in energy. However, this volcano plot usually has been calculated under a certain condition that is typical for a fuel cell when it runs at fairly high current and at fairly high efficiency. So that usually corresponds to a voltage of 0.8 or 0.9 volts. And it will change how the individual levels relate to each other, but it won't change the trend, how the different metals actually behave under these conditions.
So, one more question.
What is the difference in, a chemical energy to electrical energy conversion efficiency between the conventional catalyst now and what yours would be?
Sorry, I didn't understand the second part of the question. I was kind of misled with the beginning.
Basically, the conversion efficiency of chemical energy to electrical energy, some percentage of the chemical energy becomes electricity, the rest comes out as heat.
Yes.
So what are those ratios for the different types of these?
So
how much does it improve it?
So this is a good point. So the question is, how does, do I understand it right? How does the efficiency of converting chemical energy into electrical energy change as a result of which catalyst you're using for it, right? Yes. So I've been presenting to you the different catalysts as having different activities at a given voltage. However, you could make a similar plot where you would get the same trend, where instead of plotting activity at a given voltage, you would plot the voltage loss at a given current. And this voltage loss is actually your loss in conversion efficiency. And those catalysts that are low on this volcano plot in activity at the same time will have a larger loss in efficiency, because in order to reach the same current, you have to drive the fuel cell at a lower voltage, and then voltage times current is power, right? But you're still driving the same reaction, so you're converting the same chemical energy.
Okay. And I guess it's worth adding to that for any of these systems, it's just the basic laws of thermodynamics that say it's a lot more efficient to do it at room temperature in a fuel cell than in an internal combustion engine. So there's already a huge intrinsic advantage in this method.
Yeah,
if only we could make it affordable, and Daniel's trying as hard as he can.
There are two important points to consider here. One is, what is the theoretical efficiency of a power generating device? And for internal combustion engines, this is limited by the fact that these are heat engines. Okay, so you'll always have less. Typically, under realistic operating conditions, you'll never exceed 50% efficiency. Plus, of course, you have all the losses in the drivetrain of your car that make it even worse. In a fuel cell, the theoretical efficiency can be 100%. That is if you had no voltage loss while you're operating it. Unfortunately, of course, you'll never really get there. And the fuel cells that I've presented here cannot operate with an efficiency higher than 75%, which lies in the nature of how platinum interacts with oxygen. 75% is still a lot better, though, than what you get the other way. Now, the second point to consider is how does a fuel cell versus a combustion engine run its reaction? A fuel cell that converts hydrogen takes only hydrogen, and from the air it takes only the oxygen, and it produces clean water. A combustion engine, even if you run it on hydrogen, will take the hydrogen from the tank, and it'll take the nitrogen that comes in together with the air, right? And it'll also burn nitrogen with oxygen and form nitrogen oxides.
Okay, so maybe let's conclude there the public part of this presentation. If you folks have more questions, please come down. Daniel will be here for a while. And these fellows with the microphone are also parts of his group, so they'll be able to answer all of your questions. And the rest of you, we'll see you in 2 months for the next round of this enterprise. Daniel, thank you very, very much.